I'm talking with John Kenny, as we have done almost continuously for the last 35 years. And John has a musician who has worked all over the world in various capacities. I'm not going to attempt to outline his accomplishments. That would take the rest of the time that I have available. Anybody who's interested can look him up on Wikipedia. Now, also, this program is going to be partly about the discussion about the passage of time, and so appropriately there's the clock ticking away in the background, the old family clock. And the ultimate aim of all this is to be talking a bit about Brexit and the probable outcome of Brexit so far as working English musicians are concerned. So I'm going to start by asking John to talk a bit about what it was like working in Europe before the borders came down.
Well, actually, you're pitching me at slightly older than I really am, because I was at college in London from 1975 to 1978, and therefore we had actually joined the European community, or we had taken our faltering steps into it in 1973, and anybody who was around or is a scholar of the times would remember there was a referendum to decide definitely whether we would take full membership in 1975.
Inaccurately, I was thinking really more about the euro and the currency barriers. It was why I referred to it that way.
Yes. Well, that of course is another big shift, and as we also know, the relationship of the members of the European community, the original membership, evolved and developed out of a simple commodities market into what it has eventually become, which is a trans-border, transnational political, trading and social bloc. That effectively is what the EC became. So when I can only talk personally, I'm not a scholar. I should say what I am for anybody who doesn't know me. Firstly, I'm Anglo-Irish. I'm half English, half Irish. Secondly, I was brought up in the West Midlands, just on the edge of Birmingham, a large industrial city, which through my life has changed its nature completely from being an industrial city to being a post-industrial city, or we could say it another way, a city with vast unemployment and disemployment of its skilled labour force. I was quite unusual amongst my friends and in my background in becoming a musician. I went down to study in London at the Royal Academy of Music, and I'm a trombone player. Therefore, my instrument, the instrument that is my primary medium, the thing that I'm trained to do, and that if I'm good at anything, that's what everything springs out of being a trombone player, was never ever a part of the first rank of Western musical culture. A person like me, born after the age in which I would have had to go into national service, would have had very little chance to travel abroad. People from my background very rarely went on holidays abroad at that stage. In fact, all of my youthful holidays were taken in Ireland, where my dad came from, and that was abroad to me. I didn't go abroad until 1975. I never did anything abroad until 1975, and then I went to busk on the metro in Paris just after I left the Royal Academy, and that was my first experience of playing music in another country, was actually busking on the metro. So that's where I enter into that area. But that's important as well, because so many things have changed for the life of a person like me. The gender divide that used to exist in classical music has largely evaporated. There were virtually no female brass players, few horn players, very few trumpet players. In terms of professional trombone players, there were just none.
Women have even invaded the Vienna Philharmonic.
England invaded the Vienna Philharmonic, and this is, of course, an enormous change for the better. I only mention that because it's part of the development of our society as it is. But also, for me, there was never even the vaguest consideration of going to study abroad. I studied in London. It was the assumption that one would work entirely in London. Most players of my type of instrument in the past, if they'd been abroad, they had gone as part of the services. They'd gone as members of bands in national service, and they gained therefore a bubble view of Europe. So for me, as a young Briton, the prospect of working was really entirely to do with working within Britain. And at that stage, I found that I really wasn't satisfied with what Britain had to offer me. Or rather, I didn't think of it like that. I wasn't satisfied with what my profession had to offer me. Why? Well, I quite simply wanted to do things that trombone players didn't usually do, and I've been doing a lot of those things ever since. That's not to say that I didn't like what trombone players usually did. I just wanted to expand and do something else. It was very, very difficult to do that in the UK at that time. There wasn't a great deal of support for contemporary arts, and actually the idea of what contemporary arts were was quite constrained and restricted.
Got to toss in here that this applies very much to a generation of writers and poets as well.
Indeed it does, and it also does to designers, architects and scientists, because I don't regard my experience through the past 35, 40 years as being exceptional in any sense, and simply because I'm a musician. I'm a creative person. I've always worked trying to exploit and find ways to out my own ideas and creativity.
And of course, going back to Charles Rennie Mackintosh and his experience with being recognized in Austria and being unrecognized in his own home country.
Well, the old saying, no man is a prophet in his own land, is biblical, and it has held true forever. But I think that what is true for an artist is also true for a scientist. If we are looking at, as for an architect, for creative people, this should give us pause for thought. Why is it that Britain actually produces so many highly creative people right across the spectrum of human activity, but we are palpably very, very bad at investing in our own creativity.
This showed up in the recent Nobel Prize winners who were English by birth but are doing their work abroad.
Yes, absolutely, and I think that is probably why you've asked me to talk to you about this. But this comes up over and over again any time one gets involved in an international creative project, whether it be scientific, philosophical, artistic. One finds that British people are major contributors in every field, and yet British subvention of their life's work and of the tools they need to proceed with that work is minimal. This happens over and over and over again. It's a pattern we see. And yet, whilst we benefit from that work as a nation, and we hope that the benefits spread well beyond our own nation, we tend to undervalue it. And there is a popular view that, for instance, artistic activity is somehow extra, a frippery, non-important. It's worth remembering that every nation has both a positive and a negative public face, international perception. International perception of Great Britain is overwhelmingly, if it is positive, is to do with our cultural achievements and our scientific achievements. It is not to do with our recent history of empire.
Yeah. There's a sense in which Europe, perhaps, to paraphrase Adlai Stevenson, was dragged kicking and screaming into the global universe.
Yes, perhaps. It's also worth remembering that Britain had to join the EU. Britain was, by the time we got to the end of the 60s, in spite of its enormous creativity in so many ways, Britain was on its knees economically. The empire had dissolved, had to dissolve. Our overseas markets the markets of the Commonwealth in the United States, well, the EU was making its own powerful trading arrangements with the United States, and indeed with former Commonwealth countries, with which Britain standing alone could not compete, and Britain needed to get into the EU. The 1975 referendum was actually largely led by the Labour Party because they were worried about workers' rights and competition and free movement of people, even before these things became common. In fact, the British public voted to go in, and we get to this point. But coming back to my own experience, as a player of a minority instrument, a trombone player, I wanted to make music at a deep and profound level, if I could. I wanted to play music with an intensity which actually is open to players of stringed instruments, pianists.
As you commented to me more than once, the instrument which is perhaps closest to the human voice.
Lots of people claim this for their instruments, but there's no doubt that the trombone is intensely vocal, and that's always been my inspiration for it, actually both in terms of speech and in terms of song. So, there was I, a musician locked in the body of a trombone player, as it were. And it really hadn't occurred to me that this was a problem until I was well into my studies at the Royal Academy of Music, and I just recognised the fact that life could be fun. I could earn money. I could have work, but there were things to do with expression and intense involvement that were very, very hard to get. And I had become very disillusioned and quite angry about that by the time I was in my early 20s, and had more or less resolved to simply stop being a musician, do something else, go somewhere else. I've also always wanted to live in close contact with the great outdoors. This is one of the reasons I went to live in Scotland. I can live in a great city in Edinburgh and still have access to the great outdoors. But it's very hard to do this in London or Paris or New York. However, in order to explore my own potential as an artist, not just as a trombone player, I realised that I had to get out of my own bubble of Britishness, for the simple reason that there was no oxygen for the fire, there was not insufficient opportunity, and I had the painful experience of when projects were made, projects that I felt were important and of a very high quality, the audiences were pathetically small. One tended to go to concerts of contemporary music in London where you could know every single person in the audience. Everybody was talking to themselves. There was no real public.
A contemporary music concert was one in which the performers outnumbered the audience.
Well, that's right. We may as well have called it chamber music and done away with the concert altogether. We could have fitted both the performers and the public into a large dressing room most of the time, which was, fairly depressing. Also, it meant that the whole thing was entirely dependent upon public support, and of course, the public did not support by putting their bums on the seats. And therefore contemporary art was a very easy target for particularly right-wing politicians who wanted to cut any sort of funding for it.
So let's get as quickly as possible into Europe and how how united Europe made it possible for English musicians to expand their horizons.
Well, quite simply, the ability to work across a very wide cultural and geographic area without border restrictions, without visa requirements, and with reciprocal fiscal arrangements that meant you could easily work in another country and pay your tax and social security bill in your home nation, so tax certainly being paid, no question of tax avoidance. Of course, no doubt lots of people do practice tax avoidance, but this is a major issue. Anybody wishing to travel from the UK to the United States to work with our much vaunted special relationship is instantly instantly aware of just how hard it is to work in that great nation that overwhelmingly speaks the same language that we do. Forget it. It's very hard. It's misery.
And also, unrelated to the euro, quite aside from the question of the economic injustice between the North and the South, which is a whole topic in itself, the extent to which the euro made touring across Europe financially, economically, so infinitely easier and less complex than crossing borders and crossing currencies at the same time.
Yes, and your clock gave a little ding at that point, which is like a light bulb going on. And yes, for an individual, let's forget the global financial markets which prey upon currency conversion, speculation, the rises and falls of economics. For an individual, for a little man like me, the fact that I could work across Europe and not have to continually pay exchange conversion taxes meant the difference between the economic functioning of a project and the non-economic functioning of a project. The fact that I could make budgets in euros and they were stable. The relationship to the pound may not have been stable, but if the budget was created in euros, whatever the eventual conversion to sterling, within the area in which I was working, with either as an individual or with a group of colleagues, one could make stable budgeting. This was and has remained an issue of crucial importance, and if it's true for me as a musician, it would be true for anybody who is effectively a self-employed or small businessman. And we must remember that there are 1.5 million Britons living and working abroad as we speak now, to whom this is a crucial issue.
And I remember touring with Electric Phoenix, going from country to country, economically was like walking across a field of bowling balls.
Yes, that's right. Very, very easy, but also the fact that we were able to drive and take trains or planes, but largely to move by land, right from the north to the south.
And the dreaded carnet for all of that equipment that
Yes.
had to be examined and, at every border and checked against this enormous sheet that you had brought away.
Yes,
because
indeed.
I took with me, up to 250 items in a sound equipment, and just had to make arbitrary decisions as to what I itemized and what I didn't itemize.
Yes, exactly, and to its current value. But if they got really heavy, they could also ask you to prove it all. And it's still the case that if I am going by road or rail with a project that includes a lot of electronic equipment and musical instruments into Switzerland, this can still be a major problem. You can still find yourself held up. However, all of this talk of finance, although it's important, for me is still trivial. It is still trivial. The real point is that my life, my personal life, and I believe the lives of many British creative people who have their fire has been fed by the oxygen of the possibility of the ease of communication with colleagues and fellows across this enormously diverse European community. I have been able to explore my own creativity and to have been recognised for it. Anything that I do in the UK, any position that I have as a teacher, any influence that I am deemed to have, tiny though it may be, is the result not of work that I've done in the UK. It is work that has emanated from the UK, but has been fed and exploited in Europe.
And face to face, not just in an abstract, virtual sort of way. As I've quoted Charles Laughton to you, saying, I'm at my best when I can look into your eyes and you can look into my eyes.
Indeed, we need audience. A good example is the work that I do in theatre. My theatre company, TNT, it has been going now for, well, since 1980, I think, and For many years, the little company existed in the UK as a small-scale touring theatre company, working with subsidy against loss in the UK small-scale and middle-scale touring circuit, and we were successful. We survived, and we had good critical acclaim and so on, but it was absolutely a hand-to-mouth process and could not move beyond that area. And as the Thatcher years went on, it became plain that we would have to continue to walk the tightrope of public funding application. Increasingly, all of those applications have had such a heavy dependence upon rather extremely restrictive demands for social inclusion, for fulfilling all sorts of social and spurious social and educational responsibilities, as opposed to making good art and then making sure that this reached people across a wide social spectrum, which is what the original intent was, of course, but in the end it has simply become a Kafkaesque paper chase, which it has a most appallingly inhibitive effect on creativity. Working on the continent of Europe, that little company has been able, for the last 25 years now, to exist without any direct public subsidy whatsoever, without any applications to any government or governmental organisation for funding, no form filling. Quite simply, the work is made as well as it can be made, across a vast spectrum of style, and these days in 4 languages, and a lot of people come to see it. Bums on seats, huge numbers of children. And this is possible because the system of funding the arts is far more open, direct. Wealth is better distributed, particularly in Germany. But across the UK, across the EU, that is the case. And so that one example from my own experience says that that company alone, which is still regarded and marketed as a British company, has not premiered any of its work in Britain for over 15 years. Its members have royal honours for services to British theatre, and yet we do nothing in Britain. Why? Because we cannot do it economically without re-entering into this appalling mess that we call arts funding in Britain. We cannot do it.
Now, you told me that you have been talking at length to your students at the Guildhall about how to prepare their lives for the threat of what will happen if Brexit goes through in as destructive a way as it very well could. So if you were to talk to me like as if I were one of your students and tell me what I better look out for.
Well, for years, when I'm working with highly talented British students, I have always, above all, told them that I believe that the best way forward, the best way to have a good, satisfying artistic life, to make money out of what you want to do, not simply to play to make money and become disillusioned through boredom and ineffectuality, the best thing is to become a global citizen. And the first step to being a global citizen is to be an EU citizen. It's the easiest jumping off point, where we have the greatest social and cultural similarities. And not to be myopic, not to place restrictions on oneself and imagine one has to be a certain sort of thing. Most people in conservatoires are still being trained as orchestral musicians. This is patently a nonsense. We have only 14 symphony orchestras in this country of over 66 million people. That means that for an instrument like mine, there are only 28 full-time salaried trombone jobs, for instance. You could say the same of most wind instruments. So all of those people being trained as orchestral musicians, this is an absolute palpable nonsense.
It's like being trained to be a blacksmith or a buggy whip.
A buggy whip, yeah, or a steam engine driver.
Yeah.
It's fascinating to work with steam engines, but only a very small number of people are going to work in the heritage industry. And an awful lot of our classical music life is heritage industry. That does not mean it's not fantastic. It also doesn't mean that there isn't an enormous amount of activity in this country. But most of it is effectively what is talked about as 0 hours contract. It's short term, it's freelance, it's frequently very badly paid. Unionisation, although the Musicians' Union is a very vocal organisation and a very positive organisation, the power of unionism, the closed shop, is something that is long gone. The reality is we are totally at the whim of those organisations which employ us.
You could, of course, be talking about journalism.
We could be talking about journalism or a whole host of other activities in our society. And those, while an economy is buoyant, these checks and balances are not so noticed. The minute an economy ceases to be buoyant, my goodness, we suddenly notice them. And we're now rapidly heading in that way. Also, the fact that Brexit in the short term has meant the collapse of sterling. I think very few pundits believe that sterling is going to regain its value in the near future. It may never regain its value to the level it has enjoyed in the last 20 years. Mm-hmm. This effect of not being a part of that club immediately says that there's 1.5 million people working abroad, Britons, a lot of musicians working abroad whose contracts, whose living expenses we're paid in sterling, negotiated in sterling, but spending in Europe. I'll give you an example of my own life this last month. This time last year, I spent a month directing in Germany. And I'm a reasonably frugal eater while I'm abroad. I like to drink nice wine and go for a nice meal occasionally, but I'm not a gourmand. And my business is there to work, not to be on holiday. So, in fact, over a month, my spending in major German cities whilst working was just over £15 a day, it worked out. That's not a lot. Mm-hmm. I would say that I was more frugal this past month working in the same places, and my daily expenditure was more or less £30 a month, and that's a direct relationship to the collapse of sterling. Mm-hmm. Now that's me as an individual. Let's put that into the context of a company whose running costs may have been £15,000 a week. Well, it's suddenly £30,000 a week. Mm-hmm. And £30,000 is a very big difference from £15,000. This is the difference between success and failure. Mm-hmm. Many individuals, small companies, projects, because many artistic and scientific projects are short-term projects for which funding is specifically gathered. It's finite, the funding is finite, and the length of time during which that funding is applied to the task is also finite. If the costs suddenly multiply by almost double, those bubbles burst, they collapse, and valuable work is lost. For the individual, this can mean rapid penury. For the class of work which is being pursued, this can mean the appalling damage to the quality of work that's being done. It can mean the cessation of work, which is tragic. Mm-hmm.
And as for pensioners living abroad, on small pensions.
Absolutely. One good example is a personal friend, a wonderful jazz pianist and composer that I've worked with for many, many years, who is a Briton living in Belgium. And he's nearing 70 now, and has started to pull back his playing work because he takes his pension. It's a British pension. He's suddenly having to go out and do a lot of touring he's having to supplement that pension in a way that he'd never intended to, and that's a lot harder when you get to that. You simply get a lot tireder. He is being forced to search for work, and of course it's a buyer's market. It's not a seller's market.
There was a terrifying cartoon I saw recently of an old woman who was having her 100th birthday celebrated by a group of friends, and she is saying, "Well, this is lovely, but I've got to go out to work."
Well, yes, for some people dream of retirement. Personally, I can't imagine the concept. I think only some form of disability would make me wish to retire. But still, the positives of having worked in Europe all those years for me. And remember, I have not chosen to move to any other European country. I always say, although I live in Scotland and have done for 35 years, half Irish, half English, I'm British. I do not believe in building barriers, I believe in crossing barriers. Fundamentally, I've always, even before I had the words to frame the concept, even before I thought about it actively, I've always known that it is more important to cross barriers than to build fences.
Ian Jack, just this week in The Guardian, who is Scots by birth, but has lived in England most of his life, and who regarded himself as British, is finding himself now thinking more and more about, quote, the English as foreigners.
Well, this is a tendency throughout our nation. The Scots, where I live and where I'm very happy living, have a very, very strong cultural and national consciousness, and overwhelmingly, in all of the time that I've lived there, I have felt that to be an extremely positive thing. It's a great cement in society. It's a source of positive pride, and it makes being in Scotland a very invigorating place to be. I have also, for most of my life, felt that the English did not have a positive view of themselves. There was a rather sad tendency to put ourselves down. That I certainly found from my childhood in Birmingham onwards, a tendency to think, oh well, you know, we're not very good at it anymore. This
to
has
be
been
distinguished from the false Oxbridge conventional modesty.
well, yes, of course, there is always the false modesty of arrogance. That's what you're talking about. Also, the reaction of those who are consistently feeling culturally and economically disadvantaged, that they have had something taken away, makes people very angry, and we've seen this in a tremendous amount of that anger, both in England and in Wales, in terms of the vote for Brexit, and we've seen it overwhelmingly in what was once blue-collar USA. People who were once the blue-collar...
Which came to be identified as the middle class, because their prosperity has risen to the point where they could afford a decent house and a car, and to raise a family without the wife having to go out to work.
Yes, I mean, my own family is a perfect example. My dad was a factory worker. He was an Irishman who came to England to work, as so many Irishmen did, no work at home. He had agricultural training, but he did what most Irishmen did. He worked in all sorts of physical labour, ended up working as a factory worker, and he could support a wife who was a young violinist and 4 children, and had a very nice house and a car and a lovely garden on the salary of a production line factory worker. Such a thing is unimaginable in Britain today, but let us not... This is not possible because we do not have such industry, and we will not have such industry. People, you're exactly right, both in the USA and in Britain and other places as well, but these two nations share many similarities in this way. We are harking back not only to a political past of greatness and world domination, but also to a recent past of economic prosperity, where wealth was quite well distributed. It's a very short period in history where that is true. That's the other thing we have to remember, very short period of history. Only 80 years before, the general age of mortality was below 50. People died young, people were in poverty. In the early 20th century, millions of people were in poverty. This is not something we wish to return to, but the idea that we can't return to it needs to be examined and held up as a lie. No region of the world has a right to prosperity. Prosperity is built. It's not a right. Maybe we're getting back off the subject, but we're not, because being an artist, being a musician, we're just a tiny cog in society as a whole.
Yeah. You can argue, as people do, that it's a moral right, but one cannot remotely say that it is an economic right in the sense that it is in any way built into any economic system whatsoever.
Quite. It's all very well to say that one should have earthquake buildings. Tell that to the people who were killed in the Tokyo earthquake. You could build all the safeguards you like, but if either natural ecological disaster or economic meltdown come along, then all of your human rights and laws to protect the individual and so on are worth absolutely nothing whatsoever. All of our rights depend entirely upon economic stability, actually.
Yeah. And they depend upon a modicum of generosity.
Yes, in fact we have passed through a time which in a small part of the world, and that part of the world in both you and I were lucky enough to have been born and brought up in, our governments and our political establishments of all complexities actually believed that looking after human beings was the principal purpose of government.
Yeah.
That is something which is ceasing to be the case.
Tories of 20 years ago would today be regarded as irrelevantly left-wing as Jeremy Corbyn.
Well, each generation has its own complexion, and we have to deal with the world as we find it. And the world that we find it at the moment is a world which is increasingly unstable. For my young musicians, your question about my young musicians, my advice had always been move about, meet as many people as possible, hear, look, listen to as many people as possible, learn from them. Don't imagine that because you're in a major conservatoire in one of the world's major cities that you are in a major artistic productive complex, because that is not necessarily the case. Take advantage of the fact that you can move about. I don't say move abroad. I've always stayed here. I'm always going to stay here. I'm not going to be driven out of here. But I could not have enjoyed my life as a creative British person without the support of the rest of Europe. I could not, because the projects that I have made have overwhelmingly been supported by other European nations or collaborations of European nations. The structures that enabled me to, that continue even now to enable me to take my work to paying audiences, and a lot of those audiences are young people. Those come from the economic and social structures of greater Europe. They do not come from my own nation. My own nation has always been a part of that during my adult working life. The threat to that ability to move and collaborate is like closing a prison door to me. For my young friends, for my students, this is something which makes me terribly angry and fearful. For a start, many people who are not involved in education don't know about the Erasmus system of exchange, named for the great Jewish Dutch philosopher. The Erasmus system for the last well over 20 years has enabled both young people and mature working people to transfer themselves into other environments, to exchange their work, to spend periods of time researching, teaching and learning, but most importantly, interacting in other nations. Virtually every young person that I know...
Not unlike, in a general way, the Marshall Scholar system from America or over here.
This, of course, was one of the models for it. And in the past, one of the nascent ideas was the Prix de Rome, the idea that French scholars could go down and spend time in Rome during the 19th century. Berlioz did this, Debussy did this, and the list goes on and on and on. But that was at the time restricted to a tiny number of very privileged people. But frequently that experience, even that limited exchange, was an experience, a historically documented experience of the utmost importance for those creative people. And the evidence of that experience, the Prix de Rome, being such a vital experience, is one of the inspirational factors in post-war Europe of the decision that we must make this available to all highly motivated people. We are now running the risk of losing that for thousands of young British people. It's one example of what we'll lose, but it's a very prime example. I myself have been almost flooded with applications from other European nations who want me to go to exchange in their institution whilst the Erasmus system is up, because once Britain leaves, we have no idea whether or not there will be any cross-funding. Therefore, they will not be able to get hold of me. I'm just one example. They won't be able to get hold of me because they can't make the books balance. They can't pay for it. There is no way of cross-fertilising the funding. That particularly makes a difference, for instance, in Eastern Europe, because of course the relative balance of payments is so slanted between West and East Europe still, and yet the creativity of Poland, of Hungary, of the Czech Republic, of Slovakia, these of Bulgaria, these are enormously creative places, musically alone, in terms of literature, in terms of the visual arts, in terms of exciting new film that we don't tend to see in our multiplexes. Eastern Europe is an absolute ferment of creativity. Creativity is what makes great economic and social advance. We have been pouring scorn on Eastern Europe, which to me has always seemed appalling and obscene. We have been pouring scorn on Eastern Europe when Eastern Europe has so much to offer us. We still also have so much to offer them. It's a two-way street. So for Eastern European students to come and study in our nation, and for our people to teach and go to study in those cultures, this door is swinging shut. So we're building a new wall very, very rapidly. That's the educational thing. As far as creating work goes, another example from my own experience. As you know, John, people in my educational institutions tend to think of me as somebody who's very involved in contemporary art. But I work at the opposite end of the spectrum, as you know. I work with music archaeology, I work with scientists. And in a nutshell, my job is to make music out of rediscovered very ancient instruments and to...
Yes, interesting, in the vocal area, in Electric Phoenix, many of the singers were simultaneously involved in contemporary music and extended vocal techniques, and in medieval and Renaissance music at the same time, because so many of the techniques and the attitudes that were required of both of them were so similar.
Well, of course, yes, and as I was saying to some students just the day before yesterday, actually there's no such thing as early music. All early music, in inverted commas, is highly contemporary. The entire field it absolutely epitomizes contemporary concern with rediscovery and the combination of scholarly research and artistic output and technological development.
As Edward Pound said, make it new.
Make it new. All of the instruments are rediscovered and the craft of making them is reinvented. This is a massive business. It makes money. It's hugely popular. So if we put the capitalist hat on, we say this is good business. This sells. If we put the artistic hat on, we say this is some of the most sublimely beautiful, wonderful, exciting music which reaches out and grabs audiences. This area of contemporary activity that we call early music is a win-win-win situation. It actually ticks all the boxes of economic power, development, of artistic satisfaction, of gainful employment, and of intellectual stimulation. It has all of these things. Marvellous. So music archaeology, very expensive business.
We've reached the 11th hour.
So we have.